Afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Medical Transportation Association of New Jersey's Anti-Kickback Statute webinar featuring Brian Werfel, the American Ambulance Association's Medicare consultant. With that, it is my pleasure to turn things over to Brian. Would you please take us through the content?
Sure thing. Thank you, Amanda, and good afternoon to everyone in the great state of New Jersey. We were asked to provide this just to sort of walk through some of the basics. There's not much of a prepared content. It's really more concept than actual examples. So I'm hoping that we can just sort of more have an informal discussion. Certainly feel free to use that chat box for any specific questions, or if not, Amanda, I assume we have the ability to just let everyone open mics and talk.
Absolutely. We've got an intimate group here, and it's always great to hear New Jersey accents, so we can unmute people at will.
Right. All right. So just a quick disclaimer before we start. While I am an attorney, this is not intended to be legal, financial, or accounting advice. So if anything, that gets mentioned here is something you want to explore in deeper depth, certainly either just email me individually or, certainly reach out to your local legal or financial professionals. So before I jump into the kickback statute, I do want to just talk briefly about the Stark laws. There's a lot of confusion in our industry about how they impact EMS providers. The short version is they don't. The more technical version is that the Stark laws, or the physician self-referral law, prohibits specifically physicians from making referrals to certain designated health services in which they or an immediate family member has a financial interest. So some examples of those designated health services include clinical labs, physical or occupational therapy, radiology, all the things that you would expect a physician might have a financial interest in. And in addition to preventing the physician from making the referral, it also prohibits the entity to which the referral is made from submitting a claim to Medicare. And as I indicated earlier, it does not apply to ambulance services. Even if the ambulance service happens to be owned by a physician, ambulance services are not one of the designated health services. So I don't know about New Jersey, but in some other parts of the country, it's not unusual for a physician to own an interest in an ambulance company. And those physicians work in ERs, and those ERs order ambulances. So it raises concerns about Stark, but those concerns are not applicable legally. It doesn't apply to ambulance services. All right, so now we talk about the federal anti-kickback statute. So here I've reproduced the statute itself. It's section 1128, big B, little b of the Social Security Act. What the statute actually prohibits is offering payment of any remuneration, either directly or in exchange for the referral of services that could be paid by a federal healthcare program. It conversely also prohibits anyone from receiving any remuneration in exchange for offering referrals. So what it really gets at is a quid pro quo. And remuneration here is interpreted broadly to mean anything of value. And specifically, since the adoption of the HIPAA laws probably about 15 years ago at this point, they've specifically indicated that remuneration can include either the improper waiver of coinsurance and deductibles, and this is an issue in our industry, or the transfer of items or services for free or for anything other than fair market value. So when we analyze the kickback and how it applies to our relationships with facilities, with municipalities, with payers, et cetera, what we're really looking for is a quid pro quo. In other words, a lot of times arrangements that on their face seem to implicate the kickback statute actually really only involve consideration flowing in a single direction. So the hospital is the entity which is providing referrals to you, and the hospital is offering a concession to you. So for instance, it is becoming increasingly common for health systems to subsidize the operations of their local EMS agencies. So a hospital What's happening in the broader picture is health systems are consolidating multiple facilities. It is not uncommon for them to then eliminate the specialists at several hospitals and move them all to one centralized mothership hospital. As a result, that's increased their transportation needs, as individuals are going to the ER in an outlying hospital, now being transferred to the main hospital for specialized care. And these hospitals want to ensure that they have access to transportation. So in the past, they would contract with their local ambulance provider, and the ambulance provider would agree to show up and take them when they call. But as our mission is being pulled in multiple different directions, that same ambulance company may have 911 obligations. They may not be able to meet the timeliness of the hospital's needs. So the hospitals are offering to subsidize that or lease dedicated vehicles. That looks like it's trading something of value, money, for referrals. But when you really analyze those arrangements, all of the consideration is flowing in one direction. Both the referrals and the subsidy are flowing to the ambulance provider. That is the same reason why subsidies from a municipality for 911 calls, while on their face might look like they're implicated in the kickback statute, do not. So that's remuneration. If remuneration is being offered in exchange for referrals, it potentially violates the anti-kickback statute unless a specific safe harbor applies. So the way these work is, if you meet the requirements of the safe harbor, the thing of value being transferred is specifically excluded from the definition of remuneration, and therefore it's outside the kickback statute. So the first safe harbor that affected our industry was the original safe harbor for ambulance replenishing arrangements. So these have largely fallen by the wayside, certainly here in the Northeast, but the safe harbor protects three different types of replenishing arrangements. The first is what's called a general replenishing arrangement. So these are arrangements that are offered by a hospital to all EMS providers on an equal basis within a specific category. So for instance, any volunteer organization that drops a patient off at our hospital can have whatever supplies they use during that transport replenished. Or any municipal provider that drops off at our hospital can have their supplies replenished. Or for-profits can have them replenished, but it's always within each category on an equal basis. The second is not really a replenishing arrangement, but they call it that, and that is fair market value arrangements, where the ambulance company is reimbursing the hospital for the actual fair market value of those drugs or supplies. The third one is government mandated replenishing. There are some municipalities where the mandate from the state or the municipality is that the hospitals replenish all ambulance suppliers. So in order to qualify for this safe harbor or any of those three different replenishing arrangements, there are certain additional requirements that have to be met. The first is that the ambulance being replenished must be used to provide emergency ambulance services, and that is interpreted fairly broadly. It doesn't only mean transports that are billed as an emergency to Medicare. You must provide them at least 3 times a week, meaning it is a full-time ambulance service. Neither the hospital nor the ambulance provider and the hospital cannot both bill for the replenished drugs. That is no longer an issue since I believe it's 2005. We have no longer been able to bill separately to Medicare for the drugs. This might still have some application in certain states where Medicaid reimburses indirectly or directly for those supplies or drugs. Either the ambulance provider or the hospital has to keep records of the drugs or supplies, and the replenishing arrangement must not take into account the volume or value of the referrals. In other words, you're a big referral source for me. You take a ton of patients into my hospital, I'll replenish you. This smaller provider over there, I won't replenish. This is really just a restatement of, if we are talking about a general replenishing arrangement, the fact that all entities in similar situations be treated equally. And the parties must comply with all state and local laws, and this includes all laws related to the use and control of controlled substances. So that's one safe harbor. The second safe harbor, and the one that probably has the most direct applicability to the industry these days, is relatively recent. It came about in 2000 and I want to say 15, And this allows ambulance providers that are owned by a state or a political subdivision of a state or a federally recognized Indian tribe to waive the cost-sharing amounts that would otherwise be due from patients, provided that the provider is enrolled in the Medicare program, they've engaged in an emergency response, meaning they're a 911 entity. The cost-sharing waivers are offered on a unified basis. That should be uniform, excuse me, meaning without regard to patient-specific factors, meaning you can't waive coinsurance and deductibles from Medicare patients, but not commercial, or vice versa. And the ambulance provider does not claim the amounts waived as bad debt for payment purposes under Medicare. This would only apply if it's otherwise a hospital-based ambulance provider. So this safe harbor came about because there is a long string of advisory opinions that go back to the origin of the fee schedule in 2002, where municipal ambulance providers were asking if they could waive coinsurance and deductibles. And their argument was that they were taxpayer supported, and therefore those taxes were essentially a prepayment of the shares that would have otherwise been due from their residents. After issuing numerous favorable opinions, uniformly favorable, they just elected to just elevate it to the status of an actual safe harbor. Now, a few sort of nuances to this safe harbor. The safe harbor is not available for private EMS agencies. However, it is permissible for you to waive coinsurance and deductible if the municipality is requiring it, to the extent the municipality pays that amount, those amounts. So in a lump sum, if they calculate the total amounts that would be waived, if the municipality is willing to give that amount to you in the form of a subsidy, then you can otherwise waive coinsurance and deductibles directly from the patients. In that situation, it's not so much that they're being waived as they're just being paid by the municipality rather than the individual patients. The second sort of nuance to this one is if you are a municipality and if you do want to engage in what we would call insurance-only billing, meaning waiving coinsurance and deductibles, you can discriminate between residents and non-residents. So a fairly common version of this is a situation where waivers of I don't collect copayments and deductibles from residents, but I will collect them from non-residents. For those of you that service Jersey Turnpike or the Garden State Parkway, a good number of those automobile accidents are transients, meaning non-local, non-residents. So the argument there is the municipality is subsidizing its residents. It has no intent or desire to subsidize non-residents. Another relatively recent safe harbor deals with free or discounted local transportation. So this is not really an ambulance safe harbor. This is meant for hospitals that want to offer shuttle buses or some other type of free or local transportation or discounted local transportation. There's a couple of conditions. It can't be contingent upon the amount of services the patient would need. So I can't say I'll give you free transportation home from my ER if you came in for a relatively minor procedure, but I will if you end up needing a cardiac stent. I can't advertise or market the discount, the free or discounted local transportation, and it has to be provided locally. So originally that was 25 miles in an urban area and 50 miles in a rural area, but they've since proposed to essentially eliminate the restriction in rural areas, instead focusing on, frankly, whether or not it's an existing patient and whether or not the transportation home is fine in all instances. I can't fly you into my hospital, maybe because you need an expensive procedure like a transplant. And also the transportation cannot take the form of air, luxury, or ambulance. Now, where this comes into play with our industry is, in many cases, the entity, the hospital system that's offering this free or discounted service isn't going to provide it itself. Instead, it's going to contract with an outside vendor to provide it. You might be that vendor. And in that case, this is one of those rare instances where the law can almost be used in an aggressive format from our perspective. the OIG was very clear that while a hospital can contract with an outside vendor, they must pay fair market value for those services. So if a local hospital wants you to run a shuttle bus, you can do it, but they must pay you fair market value for it. So normally they speak to what they cannot do, as in you cannot discount below a certain amount. This is one of those rare cases where we can point to language in a rule that says it's not me that wants to be paid. In order for us to provide the service, we must be paid. And we'll see an example of some advisory opinions that sort of deal with that. So now we're going to turn to some of the more the problem areas, or where we typically get into trouble as an industry. And the biggest one is discounts. So upfront, the anti-kickback statute does not prohibit ambulance providers or suppliers from discounting the rates they charge to facilities, meaning it is perfectly permissible for you to bill less than your full bill charge to a facility. What the kickback statute focuses on is why you are willing to accept less than what you would otherwise accept. If that reason is because you anticipate getting other business from the hospital, then it implicates the kickback statute. So a rate below Medicare under certain circumstances can be permissible under the anti-kickback statute. Similarly, a rate above Medicare can violate the anti-kickback statute. So I'll give you an easy example. You normally bill $1,000 for a BLS non-emergent transport. The hospital comes to you and says, I don't want to pay $1,000, but I'll guarantee you 50 Medicare trips a month in exchange for you only billing me Y, right? That is a clear quid pro quo. You are offering them a discount, something of value, off your billed charge in exchange for an express promise of referrals of Medicare patients. Even if that discount is above Medicare, it would arguably violate the kickback statute because the intent to induce referrals is there, right? So it's not really an actual percentage. It's the intent behind why that discount is being offered. What the OIG has said is there are certain indicia, because they can't look into your head. There are certain factors that they will look at and that they believe, when evident or present, suggest an intent to induce referrals. So the big one is a rate provided below the provider's cost per transport. So if your average cost per transport is $200 and you're offering the hospital a rate of $150, my supposition would be the only reason you would do that would be you anticipate getting other business, which will pay you more to offset that loss. So it implies that there's a swapping arrangement there. Or where the price is lower than the price you're to another payer, where that other payer is responsible for an equal or greater number of transports, but lacks the ability to refer Medicare Part B business. So, two hospitals, one of which exclusively deals with Medicaid patients, the other of which exclusively deals with Medicare patients. The Medicaid hospital offers you twice as many transports a month, but the rate you have with the Medicare hospital is lower when it is the payer. The question is why? Well, they're giving you less business, so it's not a discount based on total volume. Rather, it's based on the nature of that volume, meaning Medicare trips as opposed to Medicaid trips. The other one is the discount on inpatient bundled services. This is really where sort of it hits our industry in exchange for other facility business. So bill Medicare what you bill, but when I'm being billed as the hospital because it's an inpatient, I want 50% off the Medicare allowable. Something like that would clearly implicate the kickback statute. So an example of how sort of the form in which a discount takes can be relevant is the language I've reproduced here. So this is contract language that I've pulled from a template agreement I use. And the idea here is the provider is willing to agree to charge the facility less than their full bill charge when the facility is the payer. And we'll go back to my earlier example where my bill charge is $1,000, but I'm willing to take $500 from the hospital in this situation. Let's also stipulate that $500 is above the Medicare allowable and is also above my cost per transport. So it's profitable, meaning it's not a kickback situation. But if I simply left it as the facility rate is $500, someone looking at that might compare it to my full build and wonder if there's a concession there. Instead, what I would suggest is the way you phrase it is when you are the payer hospital, the rate is my full bill charge. However, if you pay me within a certain period of time, timely payment, then I'll give you a concession on the rate down to the number we've agreed upon. In other words, I've now expressly tied the discount to prompt payment, as opposed to leaving it out there why that discount might be applicable, because what might fill that void of the reason for the discount could be seen as the referrals themselves. This also, in theory, would have the added benefit of making the facility more likely to pay you as opposed to you fighting it. So hospitals, it's one thing. Nursing homes, for sure, I would recommend this as the approach, since they're the ones that typically string us along on payments. John, I promise I'll get to the question in a second. So what I'm calling the 16 2/3% conundrum. So there is a deeply held misunderstanding in our industry that seems to suggest in its purest form that discounts are permissible below the Medicare allowed amount as long as the discount is no more than 16 2/3% off the Medicare allowable. Know where this misunderstanding comes from. What I don't understand personally is how it's taken root and been held onto so deeply in our industry. Where it comes from is there is an entirely separate prohibition in the Medicare rules that indicates that it is impermissible and an ambulance provider can be subject to civil monetary penalties if they bill Medicare substantially in excess of their average charge to non-federal payers. So line up every dollar you were paid by any payer other than Medicare, Medicaid, the VA, TRICARE, etc. So this would include commercial plans and facility payments. Figure out what the 50th percentile is for that number. If that number is substantially below Medicare, you would arguably violate this prohibition. Now, as a practical matter, as long as commercial payments are a fairly sizable portion of your total payer mix, and as long as they're significantly higher than Medicare, it is highly unlikely that you would ever have this problem. But in 2003, the OIG proposed to draw a bright line for when you violate this prohibition. And what they proposed to say is you will be per se guilty of billing Medicare substantially in excess if the Medicare allowed amount is 20% higher than your average charge to non-federal payers. When you do that math in reverse, that would mean the average charge to non-federal payers is 16 2/3% below Medicare. Or to put some numbers to it, if the Medicare allowed amount is 120, and you're billing the private payers 100, then you're billing Medicare 20% more than the private payers, or from Medicare's perspective, you're discounting 16 2/3% off Medicare. But what the OIG was proposing was to draw a bright line when you went beyond 20%. They were never suggesting that discounts between or where you were billing Medicare more than your average charge, but less than 20% more was permissible. And moreover, they never adopted the rule. They ultimately withdrew it. So it's not part of the Medicare world. Again, you can violate the kickback statute even at a rate over Medicare if the intent of the discount is to induce the referrals. Now, as a practical matter, the OIG is reluctant to go after providers when you're billing more than Medicare because the proof becomes more difficult. But in theory, if there were correspondence, emails that go back and forth, that clearly tie the referrals to that rate, there's nothing that would stop them from coming after you, even if you're over the Medicare allowed amount. So if you're thinking 16 2/3% off Medicare is a permissible discount, I disagree strongly. I would also argue that in the current environment, any discount off Medicare is probably self-defeating. We're in a position that we should be able to get at least Medicare when the facility is the payer. Now, one other thing is they do distinguish between payments that are obligations of the hospital. For instance, an inpatient bundled trip, or in the case of a SNF, an SNF consolidated billing situation, and those situations where the hospital is not legally obligated to pay, but is contractually agreed to pay. So for instance, when a hospital agrees to pay you as a payer of last resort, you can go lower on those numbers. What I would suggest in those instances is rather than have a single rate, that applies to any situation where the hospital pays, it probably makes sense to be clear and have a bifurcated rate structure. Here is the rate when you pay when you're paying under a bundled Medicare service, or for that matter, Medicaid. And this lower rate is applicable when you're paying as a guarantor. And in that case, it is permissible to go down to essentially zero, because since they're not legally obligated to pay for it, anything over zero is not a concession to the hospital. It's actually a concession from the hospital. And in that case, again, as we discussed earlier, all of the consideration is flowing towards you, the ambulance provider. So be mindful if you do have contracts where the hospital is paying you as both a federal payer, meaning a bundled service, and as a guarantor of some sort, it may make sense to bifurcate those rates and go to Medicare for the Medicare trips. And if a lower rate is justified for those other ones, so be it. Right. Municipal agreements. And John, I think this is sort of where you're getting at. So what's prohibited in the municipal agreement arena are what's called pay-to-play arrangements. So the municipality is asking the bidder to pay a certain amount as a condition of winning the 911 franchise. They will permit you to pay monies to the municipality to reimburse them for some actual cost that they incur as part of the arrangement. So if the city is providing dispatch, you can reimburse them for your proportionate share of those discount costs. How you come up with that proportionate share is really up to you. But as long as it's reasonable, it will probably pass OIG muster. In some instances, the OIG has approved additional costs being paid or amounts being paid to the city for basic oversight. So for instance, if the fire chief is responsible for overseeing response time criteria, some portion of their time, right? What they refuse to allow are payments that do not directly relate to the operation of the 911 service itself. So for instance, there was a famous one where the city was asking, as a condition of getting the agreement, for the ambulance provider to buy the city a new fire truck. And they went out of their way in the opinion to say that the fire truck would not be used as a first responder for medical emergencies. So in that case, the requester of the opinion was clearly an ambulance company, and they clearly were looking for a negative opinion. So they did clarify that the fire truck was not part of the 911 service. So John, your question, can municipalities stipulate that their subscription fee also cover non-resident employees of the town? Yes, they can. But in calculating that subscription fee, you would need to figure out what the write-offs would be for both the residents and the non-resident employees. So it's a fairly common one in a lot of these OIG opinions for the municipality to also ask that they not bill the insurance even when they transport a city worker, because they don't want to impair their workers' comp rating, so that they throw into that subsidized amount essentially the prepayment of those. Alex has a question. What about the wheelchair transport rates with nursing homes and hospitals? So it's really the same analysis, only instead of looking at how those rates compare to Medicare, because Medicare does not pay for those services, you would be looking at what the applicable Medicaid rate is. And if I recall correctly, in New Jersey, that rate is essentially zero, 15, 20 bucks, something like that. So in your case, it's probably less of a concern in the sense of there's almost no number the hospital can offer you that's not for free, or could ask for, excuse me, that's almost not providing it for free that you would willingly agree to. One thing you do just want to be careful about, especially with those nursing home agreements, is I've seen a couple of them, including in the state of New Jersey, where that agreement does not include a mileage charge for the first X number of miles. Something like 5 to 10 miles is probably not a big deal, but if it's including something like up to 50 miles, and in the state of New Jersey, that seems like a very large number, then you have to factor in what those additional miles would have generated in terms of a reimbursement from Medicaid. It's probably going to almost double, if not triple, the total Medicaid payment. So just be mindful if they're asking you to pay to eat the first X number of miles, that number is reasonable based on your operations. All right. So next up is a related issue, and that is beneficiary inducements. There is a separate prohibition of the Social Security Act, which, by the way, if you violate, can also form the basis of a kickback violation, but it prohibits you from offering any remuneration to a Medicare beneficiary if you know or should know that that thing might influence their choice of healthcare provider. So where this comes up in our industry is waivers of coinsurance and deductibles. So the OIG has expressly said that you can provide nominal gifts of less than $15 or that aggregate to $75 in the aggregate annually. Anything above those numbers becomes problematic because it could be seen as inducing the beneficiary to choose your service over a competing service. And this is not a hypothetical. This is directly getting at cash gifts that were being paid to beneficiaries, especially in the realm of dialysis providers. So there is a famous case right across the river in Philadelphia from many of you, where an ambulance provider was offering cash inducements, 15, 20 bucks, every time an existing patient would refer another patient to their service for dialysis transports. So essentially a multi-level marketing scheme. That provider was ultimately shut down. Among other things, what they really hung their hat on, the Department of Justice, was that they violated the inducement provision for beneficiaries. So what this doesn't allow is the routine waiver of coinsurance. What it does allow is waivers of coinsurance and deductibles that are made on a case-by-case basis based on the patient's financial situation. So what this is saying is you can't not bill the patients unless either the municipality has paid it on their behalf, or if you operate a membership program. I don't think any of you do in New Jersey, but if you do, the beneficiary has paid it in the form of a membership due, right? But what you can do is bill the patient for those coinsurance amounts. And if they write back to you and say, look, I'm on a fixed income, I can't afford more than 20 bucks. Certainly, let's say they owe you 150. You can certainly say, look, I'll take the 20 and write off the balance based on your financial situation. So this does permit hardship waivers on a case-by-case basis. But what it doesn't permit you is to routinely waive those coinsurance amounts. All right, and that's going to take us to sort of a bunch of different OIG opinions. I'm really just going to hit on each of the lines. There are numerous opinions on each of these sort of lines of reasoning or types of arrangements. So in that case, I've given you the most recent of them. So in advisory 15-13, and that's 2015, the OIG permitted a health system to offer a free shuttle van for its patients traveling within its component health facilities. There are similar arrangements here. So for instance, a famous one deals with patients that were being repatriated back to New Jersey after receiving care in New York City. One of the larger health systems at that time was offering a shuttle bus that would take patients over the George Washington Bridge and back to, I believe it was maybe Edison. It might have been Newark, I forget, where they would then drop them off, and then patients were able to travel, in theory, by public transportation back to their homes. So there have been a number of these. In the case of that New York opinion, it was a client of mine in the state of New York that was hired to provide the shuttle van. And they did so, and they were reimbursed for their costs by the health system. In 1409, the OIG permitted a volunteer ambulance service to waive the coinsurance and deductibles due from the residents of the municipality. Now, I am actually the one that requested this opinion, if I recall correctly. In this case, the municipality had agreed to pay my client an annual stipend, and we designed that stipend to equal or exceed the amounts that were being waived under for cost shares. In 13-18, the OIG refused to permit an arrangement involving an RFP for 911 services. Under the terms of that RFP, the winning bidder would have had to provide defibrillators and other equipment to the city first responders at below market cost. So since these were not being furnished in connection with the provision of the 911 services by the ambulance company, the reasoning from the OIG was the city would otherwise have to go out and buy those defibrillators and other equipment at a higher price point than what they were being sold them to under the proposal by the ambulance company. That difference, the difference between the fair market value of the services and the amounts that they would have had to spend at this below market rate, was the remuneration. And since it was expressly being offered in exchange for getting the RFP for the 911 franchise, the quid pro quo was there. In 13-08, the OIG permitted an arrangement in which a fire department would waive coinsurance and deductibles from city residents, but would continue to bill non-residents for these cost-sharing amounts. Again, the logic is this was the last of these opinions before they issued the safe harbor, and this is where they said why they added that language about not basing it on patient-specific factors, meaning I can discriminate against residency versus non-residency, but I can't discriminate on things like insurance status. In 1305, the OIG permitted an arrangement in which a private ambulance service would be offered the exclusive right to provide 911 services contingent upon reimbursing the city for a portion of the dispatch costs. This is the last in a series of these opinions that dealt with cities trying to claw back some amount to offset their dispatch costs. In 12-18, the OIG permitted an arrangement under which 3 municipal EMS agencies that were all relatively close to one another, in fact, they were geographically contiguous, each of them waived coinsurance and deductibles for their own residents. Each of them also had a mutual aid agreement with the other 2 agencies in which they'd sometimes go into that other area to provide 911. And in order for you to understand this, you have to understand that this was in Chicago. And a lot of these townships in the greater Chicago area have very weird shapes to them. So it's not uncommon for my EMS agency to be far closer geographically to large portions of your town than your town's own fire department. So as a result, mutual aid here was happening quite frequently. As a result, residents were getting billed for coinsurance when the out-of-town fire department showed up. And those residents were understandably upset. Had my town's EMS agency showed up, I wouldn't have gotten a bill for the coinsurance. But because your town showed up, I did. So all 3 of them wanted to agree to honor the other 2 agencies' regime of billing only to the extent of insurance. And in this case, I was also the attorney that requested this opinion. One of the things they did ask us at the time, the OIG, was essentially to show them that the numbers of mutual aid responses were roughly equal, meaning it's just as likely that I respond to your town or vice versa, that there was no, it wasn't heavily weighted in favor of the residents of one town. So that's the prepared stuff. There is one other area I want to raise. It's more along the lines of the beneficiary inducements, but it's becoming more and more of an issue nationwide. And that is, as health systems are growing in their geographic scope, and as more and more specialists are being located at the central or the mothership hospital, you're seeing more and more situations where patients are being transferred for specialty care, and now they might be bypassing a competing health system. So, to use an example, well, I'm blanking on the name of the health systems in Jersey, but to use an example, let's say the patient comes into the ED at one of my smaller hospitals and they need a cardiac cath. I'm naturally going to refer them to my cath lab, which might be at my main hospital, 30 miles away from the ED at which they walked into. But 10 miles away from that ED is a cath lab operated by my competitor. As you know, Medicare only covers the mileage to the nearest appropriate facility. So in this case, the nearest appropriate facility is 10 miles away, but the patient's going 30, that would normally create 20 extra miles. The health system would offer to pay the 20 extra miles directly to the ambulance company in order to avoid the patient getting a bill for those. Because if the patient got a bill for them, they would rightly question why I didn't just go to the competing hospital's cath lab. What the OIG said is that that is clearly an inducement to a beneficiary. Now, they were saying the hospital was the one offering the inducement. So the hospital was saying, rather than get a bill for, say, $200 for the non-covered mileage, I'll pay it. That's money the patient wouldn't have otherwise spent. That makes them more likely to choose the hospital's cath lab, right? Where this becomes a kickback problem for the ambulance company is you would be essentially engaged in a conspiracy to violate the inducement provision. So while the opinion was clear to stress that the hospital was the one that violated the prohibition, they suggested that if the ambulance company was willing to do it and willing to accept the remuneration from the hospital, then it would also arguably violate the kickback statute for that ambulance company. That was the rare case where the ambulance company was treated as the referring source in the analysis. So I did just want to mention that. So we do have Robert Wood Johnson or Meriden. Thank you, Amanda, for reminding me of the health systems. So that's it in terms of prepared materials. I guess we'll open up the floor to see if there's any questions.
Absolutely. And everyone, feel free to raise your hand if that's the easiest thing for you. If you prefer to raise your hand to ask questions out loud, or you can also enter them in the chat or the Q&A. John Iazetta, please go ahead. Let me allow you to talk. And John, you're allowed to talk. You're just on mute. There you go.
Yep. Brian. Thanks, Amanda. And hey, Brian. Just a quick question. I don't know if you remember the case. It was probably around 10 years ago out of somewhere in the area of St. Petersburg, Florida, where a health system was paying ambulance companies to expedite transports. Can you, if you recall that case, can you just go over that? Because we do have in New Jersey a lot of hospitals that are dealing with lack of ambulance resources, and providers are tending to, in essence, ask for them to be the payer rather than insurance. And I just don't know if it's similar.
Yeah, so John, if the case you're referring to is the one in Jacksonville,
it is. That's the one.
Entry ambulance in a number of hospitals. The hospitals weren't actually paying the ambulance companies for expedited service. That was, in fact, the problem. So what was going on was the hospitals were understandably trying to increase their throughput. If you've ever been to Jacksonville, Florida, everything shuts down at 6 p.m. at night. Restaurants, hospitals, restaurants, hotels, and the wheelchair van service. So what would happen is, since the hospitals would discharge 24/7, at 6 p.m. at night, patients that could otherwise go by wheelchair van couldn't, because the wheelchair van service had shut for the night. What the hospitals were doing was now suddenly indicating that these patients needed an ambulance. They would come, so the hospital would order an ambulance from the ambulance company. If it stops there and the hospital says, but they don't need an ambulance, bill the patient or bill me, it would have been permissible. But instead, what the hospitals did was they ordered an ambulance, and then they filled out a PCS form that made it look like the patient needed an ambulance. The ambulance companies then used that PCS form to justify billing Medicare for that non-medically necessary ambulance service. So from the hospital's perspective, they alleged a conspiracy to induce the ambulance companies to come and then bill Medicare. So it was a false certification. It was a false claim. It wasn't a kickback issue. Now, it became, or it touched on the kickback issue because one of the ambulance companies successfully defended the case by saying it may be the case that the hospital was falsely representing that these patients needed an ambulance, but we didn't know that. We took the PCS form at face value. We thought they needed an ambulance. They then went after them to say, but after we notified you that they didn't need an ambulance, you didn't refund the money. And when you don't refund the money, that can now be a concession because you should have billed the hospital for it. So the case really doesn't touch on this issue. To your specific question, though, hospitals lack access to EMS. They might be willing to pay for things that they weren't otherwise willing to. So under the Medicare rules, it is permissible for an otherwise covered Part B ambulance service to be paid by a hospital under an arrangement. So if the hospital says to you, I would rather you bill me than the patient, you can do so. The hospital is then free to submit a claim to Part B for the service. You see this a lot with freestanding EDs. I don't know if it's the case in New Jersey, but I'll use Florida as an example. A lot of hospital systems have opened up freestanding EDs they can't admit. So the reason they did so was to relieve the overcrowding at their existing full service hospitals. Their concern is that if patients get wind of the fact that if they go to the freestanding ED and then end up being admitted to the main hospital and go by ambulance, they're going to get a bill for that extra coinsurance. They might bypass the freestanding ED entirely and go directly to the main hospital. So in that case, a lot of these hospital systems have said they'll just pay for the ambulance trips intra-system. That is permissible. Separate and aside from that, what is also permissible is for a hospital system to essentially lease capacity from an ambulance service. So in the form of a dedicated vehicle, in the form of a certain number of hours, in the form of a subsidy, just to ensure that you have enough vehicles, whether they're dedicated to that facility or not. All of those are no different than a municipality subsidizing 911 operations. They're permissible under the kickback statute because all of the remuneration is flowing in one direction, from the hospital to the ambulance company. The ambulance company is not giving up anything of value for those referrals. So does that answer the question?
It does. Thank you very much.
Don't be shy, guys. I know you're not normally, so.
Hey, Brian. Anthony Maneri. One of the things we're seeing a lot in New Jersey is, the nursing home owners and companies are looking to basically, require companies to contract below Medicare rate and, get a discount as much as they could. So what type of documentation do you have, or something that, possibly could be provided to the facilities by providers? Or they're basically saying, in our other facilities, we have a relationship and we're paying $150 for an ambulance ride. So why are we going to pay you Medicare rate? And there are some companies that are offering rates that are, significantly below that probably would violate the statute. So what can we provide to these facilities to show them, look, not only are the provider going to have a problem, but you're also going to have a problem by, contracting at these rates. You're just as guilty as the provider.
Well, so you could provide them that Jacksonville case that I showed you. However, Anthony, let's be honest. Even if you could prove to them that it's a kickback violation, do you think they'd care?
True.
Okay. Instead, I'd suggest an entirely different approach, which is this. Okay, you're done. I am no longer picking up your facility. I have more work than I can handle. Good luck. Within a week, they will be calling you to renegotiate those terms. The way I would phrase it is we choose to do business with people that choose to do business with us and that act as good partners and operate in good faith. You are not. So you are now at the bottom of my list. I'll get to you when I get to you, if I get to you. If you'd like me to come on time, there is a cost associated with that. You're going to have to bear the cost. We have to be willing as an industry to say no. You will never win a negotiation if they think you are negotiating from a position of weakness. They cannot move the patients. By definition, if they truly need an ambulance, they can't go by any other means. And if a competitor is going to scoop up that facility and do it below cost, well, then they will eventually go bankrupt. We cannot live in fear of what our competitors might do. The only way the nursing homes, it's really just another version of the question of then they don't pay you. Now, what do you do? Right?
Right. Absolutely.
I've had clients where I said, you're cut off. I've called the administrator and said, you owe this amount. It's due today. We're cutting you off. Within a week, not only have they paid us in full the balance, but we then went on to say, because you have a history of not paying us, you're going to put money in an escrow account and we'll pull on that escrow account. We're not even going to bill you. We're just going to pull in the escrow account. So 10 grand goes into the escrow account. It's supposed to be 3 months worth. When it hits 3,000, you replenish it or you're cut off. So I wouldn't engage the argument on its merits. Whether or not it's a kickback or not is for the Department of Justice and the OIG to determine, right? You're just not willing to do it at those numbers. So I wouldn't try and, this is when I meant to say earlier about using the law as a sword as opposed to a shield, right? If you engage the argument on its merits, now we're just arguing, we're haggling, right? I'm not willing to do it whether it's legal or not, is an argument that's simple. And I don't need to because there's more demand for my services than I have capacity. If you're not willing to pay, someone else will. So, sorry, I'll get off my soapbox on that one. John, you had something?
Yep, another one, sorry. So for the municipal contracting where the municipality decides to pay a reasonable approximation of residences, copays, and deductibles, how frequently, or does the OIG opine on how frequently that needs to be reassessed?
So the way OIG opinions work are the requester lays out the facts, and then they accept those facts as true, and then issue their analysis. So you would have to, for instance, certify that these amounts are a reasonable approximation of the amounts that would be waived. They wouldn't come back and say it's okay as long as every 3 months you relook at it. So if you're asking me, from your perspective, there is an interest in revisiting this. So I would say once a year at minimum. From the municipality's perspective, they'll probably say once a year at maximum. So once a year, right? And you can even do it prospectively, as in we'll go back and look at last year, and if need be, we might adjust it 2 years in the future. If for whatever reason the legislative budgeting process doesn't allow them to easily, add additional monies. It depends on how quickly city or county government can work. One other thing I do want to mention on this is this actually allows sort of a strategic tact. So imagine a scenario where you're currently getting a subsidy and you're currently billing residents for coinsurance and deductible. Now the municipality comes to you and says, we don't have the money to pay the subsidy. We need to trim the subsidy. One of the middle grounds that you can offer is, I need the subsidy to survive, to maintain these on-time criteria, et cetera. But what I can do as a middle ground is convert the subsidy into the prepayment of coinsurance and deductibles, and then waive it going forward. So the premise there is $1 from the municipality is worth more to you than the right to bill a patient for $1, because you don't always get the dollar, right? So if they were subsidizing you and they would like to trim that subsidy, and you were billing coinsurance and you're willing to not in exchange for some amount from them, that's sort of a nice middle ground. Something you can offer them as a concession without actually giving up the money.
Thank you.
Facility agreements, John, if you're doing it, those based on some type of capitated notion, I would definitely adjust it more frequently than every 6 months, just because the most likely scenario is you're going to be underpaid, not overpaid.
Got it. Speaking of that, and I apologize because this is getting a little granular about the municipal agreement. If it was that specific agreement where, in essence, there was a consolidated invoice that matched up exactly the copays and deductibles to what the municipality was paying, but their budget did run out at the end of the year, and they asked us to completely waive, not delay, but waive the rest of the year, I gather there are some compliance issues with that.
What happens if you say no?
It was not going to go well, so we were forced to say no.
Well, no, I'm saying hypothetically, what did you believe would happen if you said no?
I believe that they would have made a claim that we breached the contract, just because the contract did stipulate it didn't say a maximum, but it had an amount in there, and it exceeded that amount because volume was much higher.
Well, so if the contract says that, if the essential contract terms are, we'll give you $50,000 and you'll waive coinsurance and deductible, is that basically what was going on?
Yeah.
Okay. So at the time, was $50,000 reasonable?
According to the volumes that they provided us, yes.
Okay. And what if the volume had turned out to be half of what they estimated? Meaning
We would have had a windfall. We would have still charged them the 50.
so there was risk on both sides of that arrangement at the time you had entered into it?
Yes.
So in that scenario, there are no compliance risks. Frankly, they're right based on the deal you struck, right?
Got it. Yeah, that's what we kind of figured at the end of the day.
Right. So it's a contractual issue. They're enforcing a contract. If they said to you, look, if the contract language said, we'll pay the coinsurance for everyone, and they internally budgeted 50,000 and it ended up being 70,000, and they don't want to pay the extra 20, and they said, if you push us, we'll terminate the contract, that's starting to look like a quid pro quo. In other words,
Yep.
I'll waive the 20,000. That's a concession to the hospital. In return, they'll continue to give me referrals. But that's not what happened in your example. But that is an argument for why there should be adjustment language.
Yep. Got it. Thank you.
It really boils down to why we overshot the mark. If we overshot the mark because something weird happened, an MRI machine at one of their EDs went down for 2 weeks. So every patient that walked into that ED had to go to another hospital and back. That's one thing, right? But if it's just something changed in their operations, they moved all the orthopedics to one hospital, and that's generating additional hip fracture transfers, or they opened a new facility and that's what threw the numbers off, that's what an adjustment mechanism really captures.
Yeah.
And by the way, you can build into that adjustment mechanism retroactivity.
Yep. Got it. Like if the volume's higher, you can look back and.
I would sell it as insurance, meaning in my example, the 50,000 should be a reasonable estimate, probably a little optimistic from your perspective, right? That way, because it's far more likely that something happens that ups the number of trips than decreases the number of trips. An MRI machine breaking for a week ups the number of trips. It's unlikely that they're going to build another facility and eliminate the need for patients to move. without you knowing well in advance of that. So the tighter the adjustment windows usually accrues to our industry's benefit.
Well, we're right at the top of the hour. Brian, I just wanted to say thank you again. Greg Scott, President of MTANJ, did you have any closing words for us?
I do. Thanks, Brian. We appreciate it. So historically, you can have good intent and make a contract with a nursing home, let's just say, or even a chain of nursing homes where you are going to do the work around the Medicare rate or above the Medicare rate, and they get a prompt pay discount. You go into that with good faith. So they take the discount and pay you whenever they feel like it. Where does the ambulance supplier stand in that situation?
Well, so knowing that happens, this language that I'm putting back up on the screen is sort of a way of addressing it. So the short answer is they owe you 100,000, right? Or let's start with they owe you 5,000 this month. They don't pay it. You complain, they ignore you.
Right.
You're going to sue them for 5,000?
Maybe, maybe not. Depends. I doubt it.
Right. And if I'm the hospital, I'm pretty sure you're not going to sue me either. Or the nursing home, I'm pretty sure you're not going to sue me either. Okay. Have we cut off service?
Well, that comes down the road, I imagine. But I'm just saying, let's just say you're somewhere in between trying to figure out if this is going to be the game.
No. Greg,
and
I'm with you. I'm
exiting.
saying after month 1, you're going to cut off service?
No.
Okay. Now month 2, it's 10,000. You going to sue them?
Probably not.
Right. You going to cut off service?
Probably not.
Right. Month 3, it's 15,000.
Then it changes the game. Now it's a different animal.
Let's fast forward for an entire year, and now it's 120,000.
I'm out of there.
Right. Okay. But if you're just going to cut off service, we haven't addressed those past payments. You're still
Right.
120,000, right?
Right.
So the problem is the average monthly bill is usually so small that the threat of you suing them is not frankly credible. But here's the thing. How did we come up with 5,000? 5,000 was based on the contract rate, right? The language I've shown here is the contract rate is my full build unless you pay me quickly. So now after a month, it's not 5,000. It might be 25,000. And after 2 months, it's 50,000. So if I do have to sue you, I'm suing you for a lot more, which perversely makes the threat that I might sue you that much more credible.
Yeah, I mean, I think the compliance issue in bigger systems, they have compliance officers and they kind of understand a lot more nowadays than they did, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. So, you can always convince a hospital system that, you want to keep your nose clean and do everything at
Not the
Medicare
hospital.
rate.
The hospitals aren't the problem. They also pay for far fewer trips. Let's just, you know what, Greg, you're being diplomatic. I'll say it. You're talking about Genesis, correct?
It could be.
Okay, right. Genesis is notorious for this. They don't think you're willing to sue them.
Mhm.
And then they'll say, well, it's not me, it's the higher ups at corporate that won't do it, or corporate says I can't pay more than blah, 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 right? Well, my response would be, I'm sorry to hear that. I wish you the best of luck. We'll take our business elsewhere. You are now at the bottom of our board. Your wait times are now 7 hours. Because the first time they miss a hospital appointment, they're going to complain.
Yeah. No, I get it. Brian, I've been in this industry for myself as a private for-profit, God willing. And I've always been accused of you're too difficult to work with. You have all these rules. I'll just call ABC and they'll come and take my patient. And you know what? We walked away.
Right.
And ABC and XYZ and other alphabet soup ambulance companies came and did, and most of them are gone. So, but I, the fact that the compliance is really been, driven home in at least some test cases like the Florida hospitals that got in trouble, the ambulance providers, and then some of the chains I know got in trouble years ago too. So it's been better to have those conversations and easier for those who are astute enough to understand where we should be. But it's gotten easier over time, but it's still a problem. There's still providers out there giving it away, and there's still nursing homes and et cetera chains still taking it, because they figure, well, maybe I get caught, maybe I don't.
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree with everything you're saying, and unfortunately, in part because of some of the regulatory design of EMS in New Jersey, with 911 being restricted and advanced life support being restricted, there is excess capacity that does a lot of interfacility work, right? I mean, so plus just in the Northeast, we tend to be a little more aggressive than some other parts of the country. In my opinion, any facility that truly cared about the compliance issue would have paid you already, if they can. And if they cared about the compliance and they were experiencing financial difficulty, they would have been honest with you. So what you're really dealing with are people that are trying to take advantage of the situation. The threat that they might get into trouble 4 years from now over a relative pittance by the DOJ rarely wins the argument, just because in a lot of cases, their margins are so tight, they don't have the luxury of worrying about what might happen.
Right.
They're just trying to keep the lights on.
Mhm.
The hospital system, certainly they do. They have a lot more to lose, right? In the case of certain national nursing home providers, they are banking on the fact that they don't believe the ambulance services will cut them off. In some cases, we've called their bluff and they've caved relatively quickly. I hate to come
Okay.
across a New York lawyer who's like, fight them, argue, sue them. But,
Okay. Well,
what I tell people is find the most egregious example of the nursing home you're probably planning to stop anyway, and sue them and send a copy of the complaint to every other nursing home provider that owes you money. Once you're willing to show them you're willing to enforce your rights, they'll decide. You'll know from their response.
Right.
But
okay.
even
Well, I appreciate it.
probably change the behavior if they're capable of paying you.
Understood. Thank you,
Thank you.
Amanda. Any closing comments?
Absolutely. Well, thank you again for joining us. I have recorded this session and will post it to the AAA's private YouTube link for viewing just by this group by tomorrow morning. I will also email everyone who attended live a copy of the PDF of Brian's slides. So thank you again to President Scott and Brian Werfel for hosting this webinar today. And we hope to see you on a future AAA or MTANJ webinar. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Amanda
Brian.
and Brian.
Bye, everyone.